Never set foot in there, my son Marcus warned me, his eyes cold as winter steel, pointing toward the old barn that had stood on our family farm for decades. The lock clicked shut behind him, and something in my chest tightened with a fear I couldn't name. Can you imagine living under the shadow of a forbidden place on your own property? What would you do if your own child treated you like a stranger in the home you built with your bare hands? I stood there in silence, watching him pocket the keys. But I already knew that the next day, when he left for his business trip, my decision would forever change everything I thought I knew about my son. But before I continue, take a quick look to make sure you're still subscribed. I don't want you to miss any of these eye-opening stories. My name is Dorothy Sinclair. I'm 67 years old, and for 38 years, I taught 3rd grade at Millfield Elementary. After my husband Robert passed away 5 years ago, I thought I'd spend my golden years peacefully on this farm we built together, watching my son Marcus take care of the land we loved. I raised him alone after Robert died, worked double shifts to keep the farm running, and gave him every opportunity I never had. When Marcus moved back home last year, saying he wanted to help with the property, I thought my prayers had been answered. The afternoon sun was filtering through the kitchen curtains as I watched Marcus walk toward that weathered barn, the same path he'd taken every month for the past year. He carried a worn leather briefcase, the kind Robert used to take to his job at the bank, and his steps had that deliberate heaviness of a man carrying secrets. The barn itself looked innocent enough from the outside. Gray wood aged by decades of Missouri weather, a simple padlock hanging from the door like a silver question mark against the darkness within. But there was something in the way Marcus moved around that building, something in how he'd change the subject whenever I asked about his monthly visits. "Just storing some equipment, Mom," he'd say. But his eyes never met mine when he said it. The neighbors had started asking questions too. Mrs. Henderson from the next farm over mentioned seeing lights in there at odd hours, and old Pete from the hardware store said Marcus had been buying some unusual supplies, heavy-duty locks, soundproofing materials, things that didn't make sense for storing farm equipment. I'd noticed other strange things too, the way Marcus would tense up whenever anyone walked near the barn, how he'd installed security cameras that pointed directly at the building, claiming they were for general property protection. The expensive new truck he'd been driving, when I knew his construction job barely paid enough to cover his basic expenses. And then there were the phone calls, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I entered the room, always ending with him saying, "Everything's secure," before hanging up. Last Tuesday, I'd been hanging laundry when I heard raised voices coming from inside the barn. Marcus was in there with someone else, a woman's voice I didn't recognize, and their conversation had an urgency that made my heart race. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were arguing about money, about keeping things quiet, about what would happen if anyone found out. As I stood there that evening, watching Marcus lock the barn once again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The briefcase he'd carried in was different from the one he'd brought out. Lighter, empty, and for the first time in months, I saw something in my son's expression that terrified me. The look of a man who had crossed a line so far that there was no way back. What I was about to discover in that barn would make those monthly visits just the beginning of a nightmare that would destroy everything I thought I knew about the son I'd raised. The next morning, Marcus loaded his truck with more luggage than a 3-day business trip should require. "I'll be back Sunday night, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek with the same mechanical affection he'd shown since moving back home. "Remember what I said about the barn?" "Mo." But as his taillights disappeared down the gravel driveway, I was already searching the house. If Marcus had hidden those keys somewhere, I was going to find them. I started in his bedroom, feeling like a thief in my own home, going through drawers I hadn't touched since he was a teenager. Nothing. The kitchen junk drawer, the hall closet, even the pockets of his work jackets hanging by the back door. Nothing. It was pure accident that I found them. While watering the geraniums on the front porch, I knocked over the ceramic frog Robert had given me years ago. As I bent to pick up the pieces, there they were, 2 brass keys taped to the bottom of that innocent little decoration. Marcus had been hiding them right under my nose, in the one place he knew I touched every single day. My hands trembled as I walked toward the barn. The afternoon was unusually quiet. Even the birds seemed to sense that something was about to change forever. The padlock felt heavy in my palm, and for a moment I hesitated. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not the musty odor of old hay and farm equipment I'd expected, but something clinical, almost sterile. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through a single window, I realized I was looking at something that defied every explanation Marcus had ever given me. The barn had been completely transformed. The walls were lined with what looked like expensive paneling, and the floor was covered in industrial carpeting. Against the far wall stood a massive steel safe, the kind you'd see in a bank, not on a farm. But that wasn't what made me gasp and stumble backward. Scattered across a folding table were documents, dozens of them. Bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies, and every single one bore my name, my signature, but I had never seen them before in my life. As I picked up the first document with shaking hands, I realized I was looking at a loan application for $50,000, secured against the farm, dated just 3 months ago. My signature was perfect. Too perfect. Every loop, every curve exactly as I would have written it. But I remembered nothing about signing this paper. I grabbed another document, a life insurance policy on myself for $200,000, with Marcus listed as the sole beneficiary. Again, my signature, but not my memory. The safe door was slightly ajar, and I could see stacks of cash inside, more money than I'd seen in my entire life. Hundreds, maybe thousands of bills bundled with rubber bands, alongside what looked like official documents, photographs, and a leather journal with Marcus's handwriting on the cover. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe Marcus was helping me with financial planning, and I'd forgotten signing some papers. Maybe the stress of Robert's death had affected my memory more than I'd realized. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for all of this. But as I flipped through more documents, each one supposedly signed by me for loans, mortgages, and policies I'd never authorized, the truth began to crystallize with horrible clarity. My son wasn't just storing equipment in this barn. He was systematically forging my signature, using my identity, and stealing from me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The leather journal fell open to a page that made my knees buckle. In Marcus's neat handwriting, I read, Phase 3 complete. Mother still has no idea. Property transfer documents ready for signature. If she becomes suspicious before the final stage, contingency plan B must be implemented immediately. I had raised a stranger. Worse than that, I had raised a thief who saw his own mother not as family, but as a target. The silence in that barn was deafening as the weight of betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of my son's deception, trying to process what felt impossible. This was Marcus, the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, who cried when I had to work late, who promised at his father's funeral that he would always take care of me. I forced myself to look through more of the papers, each one worse than the last. Credit cards opened in my name, a second mortgage on the farm I knew nothing about, even what appeared to be forged medical documents suggesting I was suffering from early-stage dementia. The cruelty of that particular lie cut deeper than anything else. He was systematically destroying my credibility, setting up a narrative that would make it impossible for anyone to believe me if I tried to expose him. The cash in the safe wasn't just from one source. I could see bank withdrawal slips, loan disbursement forms, even what looked like insurance settlement checks, all made out to me, all apparently deposited by someone with access to accounts I didn't even know existed. How long had this been going on? How many times had Marcus walked into banks, insurance offices, and legal firms with my forged signature, pretending to act on my behalf? My legs felt weak as I sank into a folding chair someone had placed near the table. The methodical nature of it all was what terrified me most. This wasn't a desperate son taking money from his mother in a moment of weakness. This was a calculated long-term operation designed to strip me of everything I owned while making sure I could never prove what was happening to me. As I sat there in that transformed barn, surrounded by the architecture of my own financial destruction, one thought kept echoing in my mind. If Marcus could do this to me, his own mother, what else was he capable of? And more importantly, what would happen when he realized I had discovered his secret? That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old farmhouse made me jump. Every shadow outside my window looked like Marcus returning early from his trip. But I knew I had to go back to that barn. What I'd found was just the surface. There had to be more, and I needed to understand the full scope of what my son was doing to me. The next morning, I returned with a flashlight and my reading glasses, determined to examine every document, every piece of evidence that would help me comprehend how deep this betrayal went. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Marcus hadn't just been forging my signature for loans and credit cards. He had created an entire false narrative about my mental state, complete with forged medical records from doctors I'd never visited, psychological evaluations I'd never undergone, and even fabricated testimony from neighbors claiming they'd witnessed concerning changes in my behavior. According to these documents, Dorothy Sinclair was a confused elderly woman whose grip on reality was rapidly deteriorating. The leather journal contained detailed notes about his strategy, written in the methodical tone of someone planning a military operation. Subject shows increased suspicion about monthly barn visits. One entry read, "May need to accelerate timeline." Dr. Hoffman confirmed he will provide supporting documentation for incompetency hearing if needed. Payment of $5,000 secured his cooperation. My hands shook as I read further. Marcus had been paying a doctor to create false medical records about me. But it got worse. Much worse. The next entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. Phase 4 preparations complete. Property transfer documents filed with county recorder. Mother's signature on power of attorney documents accepted without question. Once competency hearing is scheduled, full control of assets will be legally transferred. Estimated total value, $420,000. $420,000. That was everything. The farm, Robert's life insurance, my teacher's pension, my savings account, everything we had worked for during 40 years of marriage and 38 years of teaching children. Marcus was planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and steal every penny I had to my name. But the journal revealed something even more sinister. This wasn't Marcus's first time doing something like this. There were references to the Henderson operation and successful completion of the Morrison case. Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor who had asked about the lights in the barn. And Morrison, that name was familiar. An elderly farmer 3 counties over who had died in a nursing home last year after his family had him declared incompetent. As I tried to connect the dots, I got curious. Where are you listening to me from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I like to imagine these stories echoing in so many different places. I was looking at more than just a son stealing from his mother. Marcus was part of some kind of network, a group of people who targeted elderly property owners, systematically destroyed their credibility, and then legally stole their assets through fraudulent competency proceedings. The barn wasn't just his storage space, it was his headquarters. Hidden behind the safe, I found a second set of files. These contained photographs of other properties, other elderly people, other families who had no idea they were being watched and evaluated as potential targets. There was a woman in her 70s who looked exactly like someone Marcus had mentioned meeting at the hardware store. An elderly man whose picture was paperclipped to property records showing a valuable farm near the river. The scope of this operation was staggering. According to the notes, Marcus and his associates had successfully transferred assets worth over $2 million from elderly victims across 3 states. Some of the victims were now in nursing homes, convinced by their own families that they were suffering from dementia. Others had died under suspicious circumstances that were never investigated because, legally, they no longer owned anything worth investigating. My telephone rang, cutting through the silence of that horrible barn like a blade. I nearly jumped out of my skin before realizing it was my cell phone in my pocket. The caller ID showed Marcus's number. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in." His voice sounded casual, loving even. "Everything okay at home?" I tried to keep my voice steady, normal. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. How's your business trip going?" "Great. Should be wrapping up soon." "Hey, I've been thinking, when I get back, maybe we should talk about getting you some help around the house. I've been worried about you lately. You seem confused sometimes, forgetting things." The words felt like ice water in my veins. He was already laying the groundwork, planting the seeds of doubt about my mental state. Even as I stood surrounded by evidence of his crimes, He was beginning to gaslight me, to make me question my own perceptions. "I'm fine, Marcus. Really. I know you think you are, Mom, but—" His voice took on that patronizing tone adults use with small children. "Well, we'll talk when I get home. Love you." The line went dead, and I realized with crystal clarity that I was in immediate danger. Marcus wasn't just planning to steal from me. He was planning to destroy my credibility so completely that no one would ever believe me when I tried to expose him. And if I became too much of a problem, if I got too close to the truth, I had no doubt that I would end up like some of those other victims whose files were hidden in his barn. I wasn't just fighting to save my property anymore. I was fighting to save my life, my sanity, and my freedom. And Marcus was coming home in 2 days. I spent that entire night in the barn, going through every single document, photograph, and note in Marcus's files. By dawn, I had uncovered the full horror of what my son had become, and discovered that the betrayal ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. Hidden in a manila envelope marked "Personal Insurance," I found correspondence that made my heart stop. Letters between Marcus and someone named Janet Morrison, a woman whose last name I now recognized from the journal entries about the Morrison case. But these weren't business letters. They were love letters, intimate messages between two people who had been planning my destruction together for over a year. "My darling Marcus," one letter began. "Phase 1 with your mother is proceeding perfectly. She trusts you completely, just like my father trusted me before we had him committed. The beautiful thing about targeting our own family members is that they never see it coming. Blood makes people stupid and vulnerable. Janet Morrison, the daughter of the elderly farmer who had died in that nursing home after being declared incompetent. She hadn't been an innocent family member trying to protect her confused father. She had been Marcus's partner, his teacher, his accomplice in elder abuse on a massive scale. The letters revealed their entire relationship. They had met at a seminar about estate planning for elderly parents, where they had recognized kindred spirits in each other, children willing to destroy their own parents for money. Janet had already successfully stolen her father's farm and was coaching Marcus through the process of doing the same to me. "The key is patience," she wrote in another letter. "Don't rush the competency hearing. Make sure you have at least 6 months of documented concerning behavior before you file the petition. I made the mistake of moving too fast with Dad, and one of his neighbors got suspicious. We had to relocate him to a facility 3 states away to avoid complications. Relocate him." The casual way she wrote about moving her own father away from everything he knew, everyone who might help him, made me physically sick. Is that what they were planning for me? A lonely death in some distant nursing home where no one would know my real story? But it was the next letter that broke my heart completely. In Janet's handwriting, dated just 3 weeks ago. "Marcus, sweetheart, I'm getting impatient. Your mother is taking too long to break down. My father was showing clear signs of depression and confusion by this point in the process. Maybe we need to accelerate things. Have you considered increasing her medication levels? A few extra sleeping pills dissolved in her evening tea might help create the disorientation we need to document." They had been drugging me. Those nights when I felt unusually tired after dinner, when I would wake up groggy and confused, when I couldn't remember conversations I was sure I'd had. It wasn't age or stress. It was my own son slowly poisoning me to manufacture evidence of mental decline. I rifled through more papers with growing horror, finding medical records that showed a pattern I had been too trusting to notice. Marcus had been taking me to doctor appointments for months, claiming he was just being a concerned son, helping his aging mother stay healthy. But according to these records, he had been reporting symptoms to doctors that I had never experienced, requesting prescriptions for medications I didn't need, and even providing urine and blood samples that had somehow been contaminated with substances that would suggest cognitive problems. The depth of planning was breathtaking and terrifying. They had been documenting everything. Photographs of me looking tired or confused, audio recordings of conversations where my speech was slightly slurred from the drugs they had given me, even video footage of me struggling to remember things during what I now realized were staged interactions designed to make me appear incompetent. In a folder marked Legal Precedents, I found copies of court documents from other cases where elderly parents had been successfully stripped of their rights and assets. There were detailed notes about which judges were most sympathetic to families claiming their elderly relatives needed protection, which doctors could be bought, which lawyers specialized in expediting competency proceedings. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, about the sick thrill they got from manipulating and controlling vulnerable people. One of Janet's letters talked about how much she enjoyed watching her father struggle to understand what was happening to him, how satisfying it was to see him realize that his own daughter was destroying him and that no one would believe his protests. There's something almost intoxicating about having that much control over another person's reality, she wrote, especially when that person raised you, sacrificed for you, trusted you completely. The look in their eyes when they finally understand what you've done to them, it's better than any drug. These weren't just thieves. They were psychological predators who specifically targeted the people who loved them most, who had invested everything in raising them, who trusted them implicitly. They fed on betrayal itself, on the specific agony of being destroyed by your own child. As I read through their correspondence, I found references to other family members in their network. Marcus had a cousin in California who had successfully institutionalized her grandmother. Janet had a brother in Texas who specialized in forging documents for elderly parents with valuable mineral rights. There was an entire underground network of adult children who had turned elder abuse into a profitable family business. The most chilling discovery was a series of photographs tucked into the back of Marcus's journal. Pictures of me taken without my knowledge over the past year, sleeping, eating, watching television, working in the garden. But these weren't casual family photos. They were surveillance images taken from hiding places around the farm, documenting my daily routines and vulnerabilities like I was a target being studied before an assassination. In some of the photos, I looked genuinely confused or disoriented, evidence of the times they had successfully drugged me without my knowledge. In others, I looked perfectly normal and alert, but those photos had been marked with red ink. Delete, subject to coherent for timeline. They had been building a case against me for over a year, carefully curating evidence to support their narrative while destroying anything that contradicted their story. I wasn't just fighting for my farm or my money. I was fighting against a completely fabricated version of myself, a fictional Dorothy Sinclair who existed only in forged documents and staged photographs. The final document in the folder was a timeline titled Final Phase Implementation. According to Marcus's notes, they were planning to file the competency petition next week, immediately after his return from this business trip. The hearing was already scheduled, the judge had been selected, the medical experts had been paid for their testimony. In just 7 days, I would be sitting in a courtroom listening to my own son testify that I was a danger to myself and others, that I could no longer be trusted to make my own decisions, that everything I owned needed to be placed under his protective control. And based on the mountain of fabricated evidence they had assembled, they would win, unless I found a way to stop them first. But as I sat there in that barn, surrounded by the architecture of my own destruction, I realized that the most devastating betrayal wasn't the money, or the lies, or even the drugs. It was the realization that the child I had loved more than my own life had never really existed at all. The Marcus I had raised, the son I had sacrificed for, the boy who used to hold my hand and promise to take care of me, that person was a fiction I had created in my mind to avoid seeing the monster who had been living under my roof all along. By Saturday morning, I knew I was running out of time. Marcus would be home the next evening, and once he returned, my window of opportunity to gather evidence and find help would slam shut forever. But as I prepared to leave the farm and drive to the sheriff's office, I discovered that my situation was even more desperate than I had realized. My car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but died immediately, again and again, no matter how many times I tried. I popped the hood and found several disconnected wires that looked like they had been deliberately cut. Marcus had sabotaged my car before leaving on his trip, ensuring that I would be stranded on the farm, isolated and unable to seek help even if I discovered his secret. The landline phone in the kitchen was dead too. When I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone, just empty silence. I checked the phone jack, traced the wire to where it entered the house, and found that it had been severed just outside the kitchen window. Again, this wasn't accidental damage. It was deliberate sabotage designed to cut off my communication with the outside world. My cell phone had been working fine yesterday, but when I tried to call the sheriff's office, I discovered that I had no signal. Not just weak reception, absolutely no signal at all. I walked around the entire property, holding the phone high, trying different locations, but it was as if some invisible barrier was blocking all cellular communication to and from the farm. That's when I realized that Marcus hadn't gone on a business trip at all. He was somewhere nearby, monitoring the farm, making sure I remained isolated while he implemented whatever final phase of his plan required my complete helplessness. The disconnected car, the cut phone line, the blocked cell signal. This was a prison, and I was the only inmate who didn't know she was locked up. I was trapped on my own property, surrounded by evidence of crimes that no one else would ever see unless I could find a way to escape and bring help back with me. But how do you escape when every possible means of leaving or communicating has been systematically eliminated? The answer came from an unexpected source. As I stood in the kitchen, feeling the walls of my predicament closing in around me, I heard a familiar sound from the front yard, the distinctive rumble of Pete Henderson's old pickup truck. Pete was Mrs. Henderson's husband, the neighbor who delivered our mail when the regular postal service couldn't make it down our long gravel driveway. I ran to the window and saw Pete walking toward the house with a package in his hands, the same routine he'd followed for years when we had deliveries too large for the mailbox. But as he got closer, I noticed something different about his expression. Instead of his usual friendly wave, he was looking around nervously, glancing toward the barn, scanning the property like he was expecting trouble. When I opened the front door, Pete didn't give me his usual cheerful greeting. Instead, he stepped closer and lowered his voice to an urgent whisper. "Dorothy, we need to talk, and we don't have much time. I know what your son is doing to you." The words hit me like a physical blow. Pete Henderson, a man I'd known for 15 years but had never had more than casual conversations with, somehow knew about Marcus's crimes. How was that possible? "Come inside," I whispered back, glancing around to make sure we weren't being watched. But Pete shook his head. "Not in the house. Too many places to hide listening devices. Walk with me toward the back pasture, away from the barn and the house. Act like we're just having a normal conversation about the package." As we walked across the yard, Pete began talking in a normal voice about the weather and the upcoming harvest, but his eyes were constantly moving, scanning for threats. When we reached the old oak tree at the edge of the pasture, far enough from any buildings to avoid being overheard, he finally told me the truth. "My wife and I have been watching what's been happening here, Dorothy. We've seen the strange cars coming and going, the people taking pictures of your property, the way Marcus has been isolating you from neighbors and friends. At first, we thought maybe you were having health problems and he was just being protective." But then Martha remembered something. Martha Henderson had worked as a clerk at the county courthouse for 30 years before retiring. She had access to records, knew how to read legal documents, and understood the patterns that emerged when someone was being systematically defrauded. "She looked up the property transfers and loan applications filed in your name over the past year," Pete continued. "Dorothy, there are documents showing that you've signed over partial ownership of this farm to Marcus, that you've taken out loans against the property totaling nearly $200,000, and that you've given him power of attorney over all your financial decisions. Did you sign those papers?" "Never," I said, my voice barely audible. "I never signed anything like that." Pete nodded grimly. That's what Martha thought. She'd seen this pattern before, back when she worked at the courthouse. Adult children systematically forging their parents' signatures, creating legal documentation to support competency hearings, slowly transferring assets while the victim is still alive but legally powerless to stop it. The relief I felt at finally having someone believe me was almost overwhelming. But Pete's next words brought me crashing back to the reality of how much danger I was in. "Dorothy, Martha did some more research, and what she found scared us enough that we decided we had to warn you. Your son Marcus isn't working alone, and this isn't his first time doing something like this. We found court records from 3 other counties where elderly parents were declared incompetent and had their assets transferred to adult children. In every case, the family hired the same doctor to provide testimony about the parents' mental state, the same lawyer to handle the proceedings, and the same judge approved the competency transfers. The same judge who's scheduled to hear my case next week," I whispered. Pete's eyes widened. "You know about the hearing?" I told him everything. The barn, the documents, the letters between Marcus and Janet Morrison, the evidence of drugging and surveillance. As I spoke, Pete's expression grew darker and more concerned. Dorothy, this is bigger than we thought. What you're describing isn't just fraud. It's organized crime. There's a network of people working together to target elderly property owners, and they've probably stolen millions of dollars from families across multiple states. But as Pete was speaking, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. In the distance, partially hidden behind a stand of trees near the property line, I could see the glint of sunlight reflecting off metal. Someone was watching us through binoculars. "Pete," I whispered, trying not to move my lips, obviously. "Don't turn around, but I think we're being watched." Pete continued talking about the weather, but I could see his body tense up. After a few moments, he casually turned toward the tree line, as if admiring the autumn foliage. "Silver car about half a mile out, parked behind the Miller place," he murmured, definitely watching us with some kind of optical equipment. The surveillance meant that Marcus, or his associates, knew I had discovered something and was now communicating with neighbors. My window of opportunity was closing fast, and whatever they had planned as their final phase was probably about to be accelerated. "Pete, I need your help," I said urgently. "I have evidence hidden in that barn that could expose this entire network, but I can't get off the property. They've disabled my car and cut my phone lines." "Martha and I figured something like this might happen," Pete replied. "We've already contacted the state police and the FBI field office in Kansas City. There's an agent named Sarah Chen who specializes in elder fraud cases, and she's been building a case against this network for months. She's been waiting for a victim who was willing and able to testify. The FBI was already investigating Marcus's network. I wasn't alone in this fight after all. But Pete's next words reminded me that we were still in immediate danger. The problem is, Agent Chen is 3 hours away, and she can't get here until tomorrow morning at the earliest. We need to keep you safe until then, and we need to make sure that evidence in the barn doesn't disappear." As if summoned by our conversation, I heard the distant sound of a car engine approaching the farm. It was too early for Marcus to be returning from his supposed business trip, which meant someone else was coming. Someone who probably wasn't planning to have a friendly conversation. "That's our cue to separate," Pete said quietly. "Act normal, like we just finished talking about this package delivery. I'm going to drive home and call Agent Chen's emergency number. You get back to the house and lock the doors. Don't let anyone in, no matter who they claim to be or what story they tell you." As Pete walked back toward his truck, I clutched the package to my chest and tried to look like a normal elderly woman who had just received a routine delivery. But inside, my heart was pounding with a mixture of terror and hope. Help was coming, but I had to survive the next 18 hours for it to matter. The car engine was getting closer, and I could see dust rising from the gravel driveway. Whoever was coming was driving fast, with the urgency of people who had a job to finish and limited time to do it. I was no longer just fighting to save my property or expose my son's crimes. I was fighting to stay alive long enough for the cavalry to arrive. And based on everything I had learned about Marcus and his network over the past 2 days, I had no doubt that they would do whatever it took to silence me permanently. The silver sedan rounded the last curve of the driveway, and I could see 2 people in the front seats. Neither of them was Marcus, which meant the final phase of their operation was about to begin, and I was completely on my own. The silver sedan pulled up to my front porch, and 2 people stepped out, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a man in an expensive suit who moved with the calculated confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating vulnerable people. I recognized the woman immediately from the photographs I'd found in Marcus's files. This was Janet Morrison, Marcus's partner in crime, the woman who had coached him through the process of destroying his own mother. But it was the man who made my knees weak with recognition. Dr. Richard Hoffman, the same doctor whose name appeared on the forged medical records in the barn, the physician Marcus had been paying to create false documentation about my mental state. Seeing him here, on my property, made the scope of this conspiracy suddenly real in a way that reading about it in letters couldn't match. They approached the house with the casual authority of people who believed they had every right to be there. Janet carried a clipboard and wore the kind of sympathetic smile that social workers use when delivering bad news to families. Dr. Hoffman had a leather medical bag and the practiced bedside manner of someone who had perfected the art of appearing trustworthy while committing crimes. "Mrs. Sinclair," Janet called out, in a voice dripping with false concern. "I'm Janet Morrison from Adult Protective Services, and this is Dr. Hoffman. Your son Marcus asked us to check on you while he's away. He's been very worried about some changes in your behavior lately." Adult Protective Services. They were posing as official government representatives, using the authority of legitimate institutions to gain access to my home and complete whatever final phase of their plan required my physical presence. The audacity of it was breathtaking. They were literally impersonating social workers to facilitate elder abuse. I stood on my front porch, package still clutched in my hands, trying to appear confused and vulnerable while my mind raced through my options. If I refused to let them in, they would know I was onto their scheme. But if I let them inside my house, I might not live to see Agent Chen arrive tomorrow morning. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to make my voice sound frail and uncertain. "But Marcus didn't mention anything about Adult Protective Services. Do you have identification?" Janet's smile became slightly strained, but she reached into her purse and pulled out what looked like an official government ID card. From a distance, it appeared legitimate, complete with her photograph and an official seal. Dr. Hoffman showed me a medical license that looked equally authentic. "Mrs. Sinclair, we understand this might be confusing," Dr. Hoffman said in the patronizing tone I'd learned to recognize from Marcus's phone calls. "That's exactly why your son contacted us. He's concerned that you're having difficulty processing information and making decisions safely. We're just here to do a quick wellness check and make sure you have everything you need." A wellness check. In elder abuse cases, that was often the last step before a forced removal to a care facility. They weren't here to evaluate my mental state. They were here to create documentation that would justify having me committed immediately, before I could expose their crimes or testify against their network. But as they stood there on my porch, radiating false sympathy and manufactured concern, I noticed something that gave me a small surge of hope. Dr. Hoffman kept glancing toward the barn, and Janet's eyes had swept across the property several times since arriving. They knew I had been in there. They knew I had discovered Marcus's operation, which meant they were here not just to implement their plan, but to clean up evidence and eliminate a witness who had learned too much. "Of course," I said, stepping back and opening the front door wider. "Please come in. Can I offer you some coffee or tea?" If they were expecting to find a confused, drugged elderly woman who would meekly submit to their authority, they were about to be disappointed. But I needed them inside the house, away from potential surveillance equipment and witnesses, where I could control the situation and buy time for Agent Chen to arrive. As they entered my living room, both of them continued their performance of concerned professionals conducting a routine evaluation. Janet pulled out forms and began asking questions about my daily routine, my medications, my ability to manage household tasks. Dr. Hoffman opened his medical bag and explained that he needed to check my blood pressure and cognitive responses, but I could see them communicating with subtle glances and gestures, coordinating their approach like predators working together to corner prey. This wasn't their first time doing this, and they had clearly developed a system for quickly and efficiently neutralizing elderly victims who posed a threat to their operation. "Mrs. Sinclair," Janet said, settling into Robert's old recliner like she owned it. "Your son has shared some concerning observations with us. He mentioned that you've been forgetting conversations, becoming confused about financial matters, and showing signs of paranoid thinking. Can you tell us about that?" The gaslighting was beginning immediately. They were asking me to confirm symptoms I had never experienced, to validate a narrative of mental decline that existed only in their fabricated documents. But now I understood the game they were playing, and I was ready to play it better than they expected. "Well," I said, sitting down across from them and adopting the hesitant, uncertain tone of an elderly woman beginning to doubt herself, "I have been feeling a bit scattered lately. Sometimes I can't remember if I took my medications or if I had conversations that I thought I had. Marcus has been so worried about me." I watched their expressions change as they heard what they wanted to hear. Janet's smile became more genuine, and Dr. Hoffman leaned forward with the attentiveness of a hunter who had just spotted his quarry. They thought they were succeeding in manipulating me, which meant they would become overconfident and reveal more of their true intentions. "That must be very frightening for you," Dr. Hoffman said, pulling out a blood pressure cuff. These kinds of cognitive changes are more common than people realize, especially in women your age who have experienced significant stress. The good news is that there are excellent facilities where you can get the care and supervision you need. Facilities. Not treatment, not therapy, not support at home. Facilities. Places where elderly people disappeared from their families and communities, where their assets could be managed by protective relatives, where inconvenient witnesses to financial crimes could be silenced permanently. As Dr. Hoffman wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm, I noticed that Janet was no longer looking at her clipboard. She was studying the room, taking inventory of valuable items, assessing the property like a potential buyer. Her gaze lingered on Robert's antique desk, the family photographs in silver frames, the Persian rug we had bought for our 20th wedding anniversary. "Mrs. Sinclair," she said casually, "your son mentioned that you've been having trouble managing your financial affairs. Bills going unpaid, confusion about bank accounts, difficulty understanding legal documents. Have you noticed problems in those areas? More manufactured symptoms, more elements of their fabricated case against my competency." But her questions revealed something crucial. They needed me to verbally confirm these problems, to create audio or video evidence of me admitting to mental confusion that could be used in the competency hearing. That's when I realized they weren't just here to evaluate me or remove me from the property. They were here to record me, to capture my voice and image, confessing to the very symptoms they had been fabricating in their forged medical records. Dr. Hoffman's medical bag probably contained recording equipment, and Janet's clipboard likely had a hidden camera. "You know," I said, allowing my voice to waver slightly, "now that you mention it, I have been struggling with those things. Just yesterday, I couldn't remember if I had signed some papers Marcus brought me, and I've been finding documents around the house that I don't remember seeing before." Both of them leaned forward eagerly, and I could see Janet's hand move slightly toward her clipboard in what looked like the motion someone would use to start a recording device. They were capturing every word, building their case against me in real time using my own voice as evidence. But what they didn't know was that I was building a case against them too. Every question they asked, every leading statement they made, every assumption they revealed about their knowledge of Marcus's crimes was evidence of their participation in a criminal conspiracy. They had just admitted to being in communication with Marcus about my private medical and financial information, to having advanced knowledge of documents I supposedly couldn't remember signing, and to coordinating a plan to have me removed from my home and placed in a facility. Most importantly, they had made a crucial tactical error. By coming to my house themselves, by impersonating government officials, by attempting to create fraudulent documentation of my mental state, they had moved from behind-the-scenes manipulation to direct criminal action that could be proven and prosecuted. Dr. Hoffman finished checking my blood pressure and made notes in what appeared to be a medical chart. But I could see that he was writing much more than simple vital signs. He was documenting supposed observations about my confusion, my inability to answer questions clearly, my apparent need for immediate professional intervention. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, putting his equipment back in his bag, "based on what I'm seeing here today, I'm very concerned about your safety and well-being. I think we need to arrange for you to come with us right now for a more comprehensive evaluation at our facility, just for a few days, until we can determine the best long-term care plan for you." There it was, the trap closing. They weren't planning to file paperwork and wait for a hearing. They were planning to remove me from my property immediately, to disappear me into whatever facility they used to warehouse elderly victims while their assets were legally transferred to their criminal children. But as Dr. Hoffman spoke, I heard something that made my heart leap with hope. The distant sound of vehicles approaching the farm. Multiple vehicles, moving fast, with the purposeful rhythm of law enforcement convoy. Agent Chen had arrived early. Pete Henderson's emergency call to the FBI had brought help, and the cavalry was about to storm the castle just when I needed them most. Janet and Dr. Hoffman heard the vehicles too, and their carefully maintained professional facades began to crack. They exchanged glances that were no longer subtle, and I could see panic beginning to replace confidence in their expressions. "Mrs. Sinclair," Janet said urgently, "we really need to leave now. There are some people who might try to interfere with your treatment, People who don't understand your medical needs the way we do. But I was no longer playing the role of confused, vulnerable elderly woman. I stood up, looked both of them directly in the eyes, and spoke in the clear, strong voice of a retired schoolteacher who had spent 38 years dealing with bullies and liars. The only people who don't understand something here are the two of you. You don't understand that I've been in that barn. You don't understand that I've read every document, every letter, every piece of evidence that exposes your entire criminal network. And you don't understand that the FBI has been building a case against all of you for months. The sound of car doors slamming and official voices shouting commands filled the air outside my house. Janet and Dr. Hoffman were trapped, caught in the act of attempting to kidnap an elderly woman whose testimony was about to destroy everything they had built. But even as I heard Agent Chen's voice calling my name from the front yard, I knew that the worst revelations were still to come. Marcus was still out there somewhere, and the full scope of what he had been planning for me was about to be revealed in ways that would make everything I had discovered so far seem like just the beginning of the nightmare. Agent Sarah Chen burst through my front door with 3 other federal agents, their weapons drawn and badges clearly visible. The transformation in Janet and Dr. Hoffman was immediate and complete. The sympathetic social worker and caring physician disappeared, replaced by cornered criminals who knew their elaborate charade was over. FBI, nobody move, Agent Chen commanded, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Janet Morrison and Richard Hoffman, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder fraud, identity theft, and impersonation of federal officials. As the agents handcuffed Janet and Dr. Hoffman, I felt a surge of vindication mixed with terror. Justice was finally happening, but I could see in Janet's eyes that this wasn't over. As they led her toward the door, she turned back to me with a smile that was pure malice. "You think you've won something, Dorothy?" she hissed. "You have no idea what Marcus has planned for you. We were the gentle option. What's coming next will make everything we've done look like kindness." Agent Chen silenced her with a sharp command, but those words echoed in my mind as the criminals were loaded into federal vehicles and driven away. The immediate threat was neutralized, but Janet's parting message suggested that Marcus had contingency plans I hadn't discovered, backup strategies for dealing with a mother who had become too dangerous to their operation. "Mrs. Sinclair," Agent Chen said, settling into the chair Janet had vacated just minutes earlier, "I'm sorry you had to go through that ordeal. But your courage today has given us everything we need to dismantle this entire network. We've been tracking Marcus and his associates for 8 months, but we needed someone on the inside, someone with access to their evidence and the credibility to testify against them." Agent Chen was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent years studying the psychology of criminals who preyed on family members. She explained that the FBI had identified at least 15 elderly victims across 4 states, with total financial losses exceeding $3 million. "The problem with these family-based fraud cases," she continued, "is that the victims are usually too confused, drugged, or intimidated to provide coherent testimony. By the time we identify what's happening, the elderly person has already been declared incompetent and can't legally speak for themselves. You're the first victim we've encountered who discovered the scheme before it was completed and had the presence of mind to document the evidence." As we talked, Agent Chen's team was systematically photographing and cataloging everything in Marcus's barn. The safe, the forged documents, the surveillance photos, the letters between Marcus and Janet. All of it would become evidence in a federal prosecution that could put the entire network in prison for decades. But even as I watched justice unfold around me, I couldn't shake Janet's warning about what Marcus had planned. I shared my concerns with Agent Chen, and her expression grew somber. "Mrs. Sinclair, I need to be honest with you about something. Marcus isn't on a business trip. We've been monitoring his communications, and we know he's been in contact with people who specialize in permanent solutions to problems like you represent. The kind of people who make elderly victims disappear entirely when legal fraud becomes too risky." The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just been planning to steal from me or have me committed. He had been arranging to have me killed. My own son, the child I had raised with every ounce of love and sacrifice I possessed, had been coordinating my murder. How long do we have? I asked, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. He's scheduled to return here tonight, probably with at least 2 other people. We'll have agents positioned around the property, but Mrs. Sinclair, I need you to understand what we're asking of you. We want you to act normal when he arrives, to give him the opportunity to reveal his intentions and incriminate himself. It's the only way we can prove the full extent of his crimes and ensure that everyone involved in this network faces justice. She was asking me to use myself as bait, to sit in my own living room and wait for my son to arrive with plans to murder me. The psychological weight of that request was staggering. To consciously participate in a scenario where the child I had given life to would reveal his intention to take that life away. In that moment, alone in my house with Agent Chen, I knew there was no turning back, but I found myself thinking, if you were in my shoes, would you have the courage to face it, or would you stay silent to survive? Write in the comments. I really want to know. I'll do it, I said, and as the words left my mouth, I felt something fundamental change inside me. The Dorothy Sinclair who had spent 67 years trying to see the best in people, who had made excuses for bad behavior and trusted blindly in family bonds, was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, someone who understood that survival sometimes requires you to become a person you never thought you could be. Agent Chen spent the next 2 hours preparing me for Marcus's return. She explained how the recording equipment worked, where the hidden cameras were positioned, what phrases I should use to encourage him to reveal his plans. Most importantly, she showed me the panic button I could press if the situation became immediately dangerous. Remember, she said as her team took their positions around the property, we'll be listening to everything, and we can be inside the house in under 30 seconds. But we need him to believe he's in control, that he's successfully manipulated you into a vulnerable position. Can you do that? I nodded, but inside I was terrified, not just of the physical danger, but of what I was about to learn about the depth of Marcus's hatred for me. How do you prepare to hear your own child explain why you need to die? As darkness fell across the farm, I sat in Robert's old recliner, the same chair where Janet had sat just hours earlier, and waited for my son to come home with murder on his mind. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow moving past the windows could be Marcus approaching with his accomplices. At exactly 9:30, I heard the familiar sound of Marcus's truck turning into the driveway. But tonight, there were other vehicles with him. At least 2 additional cars following behind, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searching eyes. My heart pounded as I heard car doors slamming, voices conferring in urgent whispers, footsteps approaching the house with the careful coordination of people executing a plan they had rehearsed. Through the kitchen window, I could see 3 figures moving around the house, checking windows, testing doors, positioning themselves like tactical team preparing for an assault. When Marcus finally knocked on the front door, his voice carried the same casual warmth it had always had. "Mom, I'm home. Sorry I'm back so late. The meetings ran longer than expected." I opened the door and looked into the face of my son, the child I had rocked to sleep, whose fever I had monitored through countless childhood illnesses, who had walked across the stage to receive his high school diploma while I cheered from the audience. Tonight, that face belonged to a stranger who had come to kill me. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, embracing him with the same maternal affection I had shown him every day of his life. "How was your trip?" "Productive," he replied, and I could hear layers of meaning in that single word. "Actually, Mom, I brought some friends with me. Business associates who wanted to meet you. Is that okay?" Business associates. Assassins was the more accurate term, but I nodded and smiled, like the trusting mother he expected me to be. "Of course, honey. Any friend of yours is welcome here." Marcus stepped aside, and 2 men entered my house. Both were younger than him, with the lean build and alert eyes of people accustomed to violence. They introduced themselves with first names only, Rick and Tony, and claimed to be colleagues from Marcus's construction company. But everything about them screamed danger, from their careful assessment of the room's exits to the way their hands never strayed far from their jacket pockets. "Mrs. Sinclair," Rick said, settling onto my couch with predatory ease. "Marcus has told us so much about you. He's been worried about your health lately, about some confusion and memory problems you've been having. Even now, even with hired killers in my living room, They were still maintaining the fiction of concerned family members, dealing with an elderly woman's decline. The psychological manipulation was so deeply ingrained in their approach that they couldn't abandon it even when preparing for murder. "Mom," Marcus said, sitting down across from me with an expression of manufactured concern. "I heard that some people came by the house today claiming to be from Adult Protective Services. Did that happen?" This was it, the moment when I had to choose between the safety of silence and the courage to expose the truth. Agent Chen and her team were listening, recording every word, waiting for Marcus to reveal enough criminal intent to justify their intervention. "Yes," I said, allowing confusion to creep into my voice. "A woman named Janet and a doctor. They asked me a lot of questions about my memory and my ability to take care of myself. Marcus, they said you had called them because you were worried about me." Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and I could see calculation behind his eyes. He was trying to determine how much I knew, how much Janet and Dr. Hoffman had revealed before their arrest, whether I was still the trusting, manipulable mother he had been counting on. "Mom," he said gently, "those people weren't really from Adult Protective Services. They were criminals, con artists who target elderly people living alone. I'm so sorry they confused and frightened you." The audacity of it was breathtaking. Even now, even with federal agents positioned outside my house, Marcus was continuing to gaslight me, to twist reality in ways that made him appear protective while casting me as the vulnerable victim who couldn't distinguish between legitimate authorities and criminals. But Tony, the younger of the two assassins, was growing impatient with the psychological games. "Marcus, we don't have time for this. The longer we wait, the more complicated this gets. Your mother has seen too much, knows too much. The gentle approach is off the table." "Tony's right," Rick added, pulling something metallic from his jacket pocket. "Mrs. Sinclair, I'm sorry, but we can't let you contact the authorities about what you think you discovered. Some situations require permanent solutions." Marcus stood up and looked down at me with an expression I had never seen before. Cold, calculating, completely devoid of any trace of the love or connection that should exist between a mother and child. In that moment, I realized that Janet had been wrong about one thing. This wasn't going to be worse than what she and Dr. Hoffman had planned. This was exactly what Marcus had always intended. My death was the goal, not an unfortunate necessity. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, and his voice carried no trace of genuine regret. "But you should have minded your own business. You should have trusted me to take care of everything like I always have. Now it's too late for both of us." The panic button was in my right hand, hidden beneath a throw pillow. Agent Chen and her team were less than 30 seconds away. But as I looked at my son's face and saw no trace of the child I had loved, I realized that survival was no longer my primary concern. I wanted Marcus to know that I understood exactly who he was and what he had done. I wanted him to face the truth about himself before the FBI burst through my door and ended this nightmare forever. "Marcus," I said, standing up and looking him directly in the eyes, "I've been in the barn. I've seen the forged documents, the letters between you and Janet, the surveillance photos, the evidence of how you've been drugging me. I know about the other victims, the network you've built, the lives you've destroyed. I know everything." The mask slipped completely from his face, and for the first time in years, I saw my son's true nature without any pretense or manipulation. The hatred in his eyes was pure and absolute, the rage of a predator whose carefully constructed facade had been stripped away. "You stupid old woman," he snarled. "Do you have any idea how much money you've cost me? How many years of planning you've destroyed? You were supposed to die quietly, confused and grateful for my care. Instead, you had to go snooping around like some pathetic amateur detective. Why?" I asked, and my voice was steady despite the terror coursing through my veins. "Why did you hate me so much that you wanted me dead?" Marcus laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth or humanity. "Hate you? Mom, this was never about emotion. It was about money, opportunity, and the simple fact that you were worth more to me dead than alive. Nothing personal. Just business." That's when I pressed the panic button and heard the most beautiful sound of my life. Agent Chen's voice shouting, "FBI, drop your weapons," as federal agents poured through every entrance to my house simultaneously. The next few minutes were chaos, shouting, gunshots, the sound of furniture overturning as Rick and Tony tried to resist arrest. But through it all, I never took my eyes off Marcus's face as he was handcuffed and read his rights. I wanted to remember this moment, when the child I had raised finally revealed himself as the monster he had always been. As they led him toward the door, Marcus turned back to me one last time. "This isn't over, Mom. There are people you don't know about, people who won't forgive what you've done to our business. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." But I was no longer afraid of his threats or his promises of revenge. I had looked evil directly in the face and refused to be destroyed by it. Whatever came next, I would face it as the person I had become. A survivor who had chosen courage over compliance, truth over family loyalty, justice over the comfortable lies that had nearly cost me everything. 3 days later, I sat across from Marcus in a federal holding facility, separated by bulletproof glass and connected only by a telephone that made his voice sound hollow and distant. Agent Chen had arranged this meeting against the advice of the prosecution team, but I had insisted. There were questions that needed answers, truths that only Marcus could provide. He looked smaller in the orange jumpsuit, diminished by the institutional setting and the weight of charges that would likely keep him in prison for the rest of his life. But his eyes still held that cold calculation I had seen in my living room, the complete absence of remorse or recognition that he had done anything wrong. "Hello, Mom?" he said into the phone. And even now, he managed to make those words sound like an accusation rather than a greeting. "I need to understand why," I said without preamble. "Not the money. I understand greed. I need to understand how you convinced yourself that I deserved to die." Marcus leaned back in his chair and studied me like I was a particularly interesting specimen in a laboratory. "You really don't get it, do you? This was never about what you deserved. It was about what I deserved after spending my entire life watching you play the martyr." The bitterness in his voice was decades old, a resentment that had been festering since childhood. But his next words revealed a depth of psychological distortion I hadn't anticipated. "Do you remember how you used to tell people about all the sacrifices you made for me? Working 2 jobs, going without things you wanted, staying up nights when I was sick? You wore your suffering like a badge of honor, made sure everyone knew what a devoted mother you were." I remembered those conversations, moments when I had shared the challenges of single parenthood with friends and neighbors. What I had intended as explanations for why we lived modestly had apparently been received by Marcus as public humiliation. "I was proud of how hard we worked together," I said. "I never meant to embarrass you." "Proud?" Marcus laughed, that same cold sound I had heard in my living room. "You were proud of being poor, of struggling, of making me wear second-hand clothes and eat generic cereal. You turned poverty into a virtue and made me complicit in your performance of noble suffering." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another visitor, a man in an expensive suit who nodded to Marcus through the glass before taking a seat at a nearby table. I recognized him immediately from the photographs in Marcus's barn files. This was attorney William Graves, the lawyer who had been facilitating fraudulent competency hearings across multiple states. But Graves wasn't here as Marcus's attorney. As I watched their interaction, I realized with growing horror that he was here as his partner, still actively working to protect their criminal network, even while Marcus was in federal custody. "Marcus," I said urgently, "who is that man, and why is he here?" But Marcus's attention had shifted completely to Graves, and they were communicating through a series of subtle gestures that suggested a prearranged system. Hand signals, nods, positioning of objects on the table. They were coordinating something even while under federal surveillance. Agent Chen appeared beside me, her expression grim. "Mrs. Sinclair, we need to end this visit now. We've just learned that Attorney Graves isn't here in any legal capacity. He's here as part of an escape attempt." The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare, choreographed in slow motion. Graves stood up and pressed something against the wall that caused all the lights in the facility to go out simultaneously. Emergency generators kicked in, bathing everything in red light, while alarms began blaring throughout the building. In the chaos that followed, I saw Marcus smile for the first time since his arrest, not the fake warmth he had shown me for years, but genuine pleasure at the prospect of freedom and revenge. Guards were shouting, prisoners were being moved to secure locations, and somewhere in the darkness, people were implementing a plan that had been weeks in the making. But the escape attempt failed. Agent Chen's team had been monitoring Graves for months, anticipating exactly this kind of desperate move. Within 10 minutes, the lights were restored, Marcus was back in his cell, and Graves was in handcuffs facing additional charges for attempting to facilitate a prisoner escape. As order was restored, Marcus looked at me through the glass one final time, and his expression contained a promise that made my blood freeze. The network he had built wasn't just about him. It included people I hadn't identified yet, resources I didn't understand, and contingency plans that extended far beyond what I had discovered in that barn. "This conversation isn't over, Mom," he said, as guards prepared to escort him back to his cell. "And neither is our business relationship." Agent Chen ended the visit immediately, but as we walked back to her car, she shared information that explained Marcus's confidence and Graves's desperate rescue attempt. "Mrs. Sinclair, we've identified at least 30 people involved in this network, but we've only arrested 8 of them. The others are still operating, still targeting elderly victims, and now they're extremely motivated to eliminate the witness who exposed their operation." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had thought that Marcus's arrest meant the end of the threat, but it was actually just the beginning of a much more dangerous phase. The remaining members of his network weren't just continuing their criminal activities, they were actively hunting me. "What does that mean for my safety?" I asked. "It means you can't go home," Agent Chen replied. "It means we're placing you in witness protection until the entire network is dismantled. And it means that the person who raised Marcus isn't the only family member involved in this conspiracy." The last sentence stopped me cold. "What are you talking about?" Agent Chen handed me a photograph that made my world collapse for the second time in a week. It showed my younger sister Helen, whom I hadn't seen in 5 years, sitting at a restaurant table with Janet Morrison and attorney Graves. The date stamp indicated it was taken 6 months ago, long before I had discovered Marcus's crimes. "Your sister Helen has been part of this network from the beginning," Agent Chen said gently. "She's the one who identified you as a target, who provided them with your financial information and psychological profile. Marcus didn't choose to victimize his mother randomly. He was recruited to do it by his aunt. The betrayal was so complete, so comprehensive, that I couldn't process it emotionally. My sister, the person who had shared my childhood, who knew my vulnerabilities and fears better than anyone, had sold me to criminals who planned to destroy my life and end it. But even as that realization devastated me, it also answered questions I hadn't known to ask. How had Marcus known so much about my daily routines, my financial accounts, my relationships with neighbors? How had he been able to forge my signature so perfectly? How had he known exactly which psychological pressures would be most effective in manipulating me? Helen had provided the intelligence, the insider knowledge that made me the perfect victim. She had turned family intimacy into a weapon that nearly killed me. As Agent Chen drove me away from the prison and toward a safe house where I would spend the next several months, I realized that the confrontation in that visiting room hadn't provided the closure I was seeking. Instead, it had revealed that the nightmare was far from over, and that the enemy I was fighting included people I had loved and trusted for my entire life. The war against Marcus's network was just beginning, and I was no longer just a victim who had escaped. I was a weapon they desperately needed to silence, and they would use every resource at their disposal, including the rest of my family, to make sure I never testified against them. The safe house was a modest apartment in Kansas City, 3 hours from everything I had ever called home. For 6 weeks, I lived under the protection of federal marshals while Agent Chen's team systematically dismantled the network that had nearly destroyed me. Every morning brought news of additional arrests, seized assets, and evidence that revealed the true scope of their crimes. But it was Helen's arrest that broke something fundamental inside me. Watching my younger sister led away in handcuffs while protesting her innocence, claiming she had been trying to protect me from Marcus's influence, felt like losing the last connection to the family I thought I had known. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Bank records showed payments from the network totaling over $100,000 across 2 years. Phone recordings captured her providing detailed information about my habits, my fears, my financial vulnerabilities. Most devastating of all were the emails where she had suggested specific psychological tactics for breaking down my resistance to their manipulation. Dorothy was always the strong one, she had written to Janet Morrison. But she has two weaknesses: her guilt about not doing enough for Marcus and her terror of being a burden to anyone. If you can convince her that she's becoming incompetent and that accepting help is the responsible thing to do, she'll cooperate with her own destruction. My own sister had written the playbook for my psychological demolition. She had turned 67 years of shared history, every confidence I had shared with her, every vulnerability I had revealed, into ammunition for people who wanted to steal my life. The day of Marcus's sentencing arrived like the culmination of a nightmare I could finally wake up from. The federal courthouse in Kansas City was packed with victims, family members, and media covering what prosecutors called the largest elder fraud conspiracy in Missouri history. I sat in the front row as victim after victim testified about the devastation Marcus and his network had caused. Elderly people who had been declared incompetent and institutionalized while their children stole their homes. Seniors who had died in suspicious circumstances after transferring their assets to protective relatives. Families torn apart by greed disguised as care. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the witness stand and looked directly at Marcus for the first time since that horrible night in my living room. He sat at the defendant's table in a suit that made him look respectable, surrounded by lawyers who were still trying to minimize his culpability by portraying him as a troubled son who had been led astray by more sophisticated criminals. "Your Honor," I began, and my voice carried the strength of someone who had survived the unthinkable. "Marcus Sinclair isn't a victim of anyone's influence. He's a predator who spent years planning my destruction with the methodical patience of someone who enjoys causing pain to people who trust him." I testified for 2 hours, walking the court through every document I had found, every moment of realization, every layer of betrayal that had nearly cost me my life. I described the drugs in my tea, the forged signatures, the surveillance photos, the plans for my murder that I had discovered in his own handwriting. But more importantly, I testified about the psychological devastation of learning that your own child sees you not as a person to be loved, but as an asset to be harvested. I wanted the judge to understand that the financial crimes were just the surface. The real damage was the complete destruction of trust between family members. When I finished speaking, Marcus was allowed to make a statement before sentencing. He stood up, looked directly at me, and spoke words that will haunt me for the rest of my life. "I'm sorry that my mother feels hurt by my actions," he said, his voice carrying no trace of genuine remorse. "But I want this court to understand that everything I did was motivated by concern for her well-being. She's an elderly woman living alone on a valuable property, vulnerable to scams and exploitation. I was trying to protect her assets and ensure her safety. Even now, even facing decades in prison, Marcus was still gaslighting me, still trying to convince a room full of people that attempted murder was actually an act of love. The audacity of it was breathtaking, but it also revealed the depth of his psychological distortion. He genuinely believed his own lies. Judge Morrison, no relation to Janet Morrison, had heard enough. She sentenced Marcus to 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Janet received 28 years. Dr. Hoffman got 15 years and the permanent revocation of his medical license. Attorney Graves was sentenced to 22 years and disbarred. Helen, as a first-time offender who had cooperated with prosecutors, received 8 years and was required to pay full restitution for her role in the conspiracy. As they led her away, she tried to catch my eye one final time, but I couldn't bear to look at her. The sister I had grown up with was gone, replaced by a stranger who had sold my life for money. In total, 17 people were convicted and sentenced for their roles in the network. Authorities recovered over $2 million in stolen assets, though much of the money had already been spent or hidden in offshore accounts. More importantly, they had shut down an operation that might have victimized dozens more elderly people if it had been allowed to continue. The victory felt hollow in ways I hadn't expected. Justice had been served, the criminals were behind bars, and I had recovered most of my financial losses. But the psychological damage felt permanent and irreversible. Marcus and Helen weren't just going to prison. They were dead to me, erased from my life as completely as if they had never existed. Agent Chen drove me back to the farm on a gray October afternoon, 6 months after that terrible night when federal agents had saved my life. The property looked exactly the same, but I felt like a different person walking through rooms where I had once felt safe and loved. The barn had been emptied of all evidence, but I couldn't bring myself to enter it. Instead, I hired a demolition crew to tear it down completely, to erase every trace of the space where my son had planned my destruction. I wanted nothing left standing that could remind me of how thoroughly I had been betrayed by the people I loved most. As I walked through my house, touching familiar objects and trying to reclaim a sense of home, I realized that survival had come with a price I was still learning to calculate. I had saved my life and my property, but I had lost my family, my trust in human nature, and my ability to believe that love was stronger than greed. The phone rang as I stood in the kitchen where Marcus had made me tea laced with drugs designed to make me appear confused and incompetent. It was Pete Henderson, my neighbor, calling to welcome me home and invite me for dinner. "Dorothy," he said, "Martha and I want you to know that you're not alone in this. What happened to you could have happened to any of us, and the courage you showed in fighting back probably saved other families from going through the same nightmare." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of something that might eventually become hope. Marcus and Helen were gone, but there were still people in the world capable of genuine kindness, neighbors who had risked their own safety to help me when I needed it most. The victory was real, even if it felt incomplete. I had faced evil and refused to be destroyed by it. I had chosen truth over comfortable lies, justice over family loyalty, and courage over compliance. The person I had become through this ordeal was stronger than the person I had been before, even if she was also lonelier and more guarded. As darkness fell over the farm that had nearly become my grave, I made myself a cup of tea, carefully prepared by my own hands, and sat in Robert's chair to watch the sunset through windows that no longer held surveillance cameras. I was free, I was alive, and I had learned that sometimes survival requires you to become someone you never thought you could be. The nightmare was over, but the woman who had lived through it was forever changed. 2 years have passed since that terrible night when I discovered who my son really was. I'm 69 now, and the woman who sits in this kitchen writing down her story is someone Dorothy Sinclair from 3 years ago would barely recognize. The farm is quieter these days. I sold off the back 40 acres to Pete and Martha Henderson, keeping just enough land for a small garden and the old farmhouse that Robert and I built together. The money sits in accounts that only I have access to, managed by a financial advisor who underwent extensive FBI background checks before I would even speak with her. I've learned to live with locks on every door, security cameras that I monitor myself, and the kind of hypervigilance that comes from knowing that your own family tried to kill you. It's not paranoia when the threat was real, when the people who hurt you shared your DNA and your dining room table. Marcus writes me letters from federal prison. They arrive every few months, carefully worded attempts to re-establish communication that the prison censors allow through, because they contain no obvious threats. He tells me about his life behind bars, claims to have found religion, insists that he spent countless hours reflecting on his mistakes and the pain he caused me. I burn every letter without reading it completely. There's nothing he could write that would change what he did or who he chose to become. The son I raised died for me the night he brought killers to my house, and I have no interest in communicating with the stranger who took his place. Helen was released last month after serving her full sentence. She sent me a card with a local return address, which means she's moved back to Missouri despite the conditions of her parole requiring her to avoid contact with victims. The card contained a single sentence: "I pray every day that you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I threw that away too. Forgiveness isn't something you find in your heart like loose change in a coat pocket. It's something you choose to give when the person seeking it has demonstrated genuine remorse and taken meaningful steps to repair the damage they caused. Helen's card felt like another manipulation, another attempt to make me responsible for managing her guilt and shame. The Henderson family has become my chosen family in ways that blood relations never were. Pete drives me to medical appointments and helps with repairs around the house. Martha and I have coffee every Tuesday morning, and she's taught me to can vegetables from my garden. Their grandchildren call me Grandma Dorothy and leave drawings stuck to my refrigerator with magnets shaped like farm animals. Sometimes I catch myself wondering what my life would have been like if Marcus had been the son I thought he was, if Helen had been the sister I believed her to be. Would I be surrounded by grandchildren and holiday dinners, wrapped in the warm chaos of a large, loving family? The grief for that imaginary life hits me at unexpected moments. When I see families together at the grocery store, when I hear children laughing, when holidays arrive with no one to celebrate them with. But I've also discovered freedoms I never had when I was trying to maintain relationships with people who saw me as a resource to be exploited, rather than a person to be loved. My money is my own. My time belongs to me. My decisions aren't filtered through the question of how they might affect family members who were secretly planning my destruction. I volunteer now at a legal aid clinic, helping elderly people navigate the complex systems that are supposed to protect them from financial abuse. I've become something of an expert in recognizing the warning signs of family-based fraud, and I've helped 3 other seniors escape situations similar to what I endured. There's a bitter satisfaction in using the knowledge I gained from my own victimization to protect other people from the same fate. I understand the psychology of predators who target family members, the legal mechanisms they exploit, the emotional manipulation tactics they use to isolate and control their victims. I speak their language now, and I can teach others to recognize it before it's too late. Last month, I testified before a state legislative committee that was considering stronger penalties for elder abuse committed by family members. I told them that the current legal system treats these crimes as civil family disputes rather than the organized fraud and psychological torture they actually represent. When a stranger steals from an elderly person, we call it theft and prosecute it accordingly, I told the committee. But when a son steals from his mother or a daughter defrauds her father, we call it a family matter and suggest counseling. This distinction is not just wrong, it's deadly. Family predators are more dangerous than strangers because they have unlimited access to their victims and complete knowledge of their vulnerabilities. The committee listened, took notes, and promised to consider stronger legislation. Whether they'll follow through remains to be seen, but I'll keep testifying. Keep speaking, keep using my voice to shine light into the dark corners where family secrets hide crimes. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the security system is armed, I allow myself to remember the good times with Marcus and Helen. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings, family vacations and silly arguments. Moments when I believed we were genuinely connected by love rather than convenience and opportunity. Those memories feel like they belong to someone else now, like scenes from a movie about a different woman's life. The people in those memories were fictional characters, roles that Marcus and Helen played convincingly enough to fool me for decades. The real Marcus was always the one who saw me as a walking bank account. The real Helen was always the one who would sell her sister's life for the right price. Learning to accept that truth without becoming completely cynical about human nature has been the hardest part of healing. I still believe in genuine love, authentic kindness, and the possibility of family bonds that aren't corrupted by greed or manipulation. I see it in the Hendersons, in the volunteers at the legal clinic, in the strangers who help each other during difficult times without expecting anything in return. But I also know now that love and family loyalty can be faked with frightening authenticity by people whose only genuine emotion is contempt for anyone they perceive as weak or vulnerable. I know that the people who hurt you most are often the ones who know exactly what will cause you the deepest pain. This knowledge hasn't made me a suspicious person who distrusts everyone, but it has made me a careful person who pays attention to actions rather than words, who values consistency over charisma, who understands that real love demonstrates itself through behavior rather than declarations. As I finish writing this story, I'm sitting at the same kitchen table where Marcus used to drug my tea and where federal agents later saved my life. The sunrise outside my window illuminates a property that belongs completely to me, a life that I've rebuilt on my own terms, a future that no one can steal because I've learned to protect it properly. The scars from this experience will never fully fade, and some losses, the death of trust, the end of innocence about family bonds, are permanent. But I'm still here. I'm still fighting, and I've discovered strength I never knew I possessed. If someone had told Dorothy Sinclair 3 years ago that she would survive her son's attempts to drug her, defraud her, and ultimately kill her, she wouldn't have believed it was possible. The woman she was then couldn't have imagined becoming someone capable of facing down killers in her living room, testifying against her own family in federal court, or rebuilding a meaningful life from the ashes of such complete betrayal. But she did survive, and she did rebuild, and she learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to let other people's evil destroy your capacity for goodness. Yesterday, I received a letter from a woman in California whose adult daughter had been systematically stealing from her for months. She had read about my case in a magazine article and wanted to know if I thought she was strong enough to fight back against her own child. "Yes," I wrote back to her. "You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more capable of survival than anyone has ever told you. Trust your instincts, document everything, and don't let anyone convince you that family loyalty requires you to accept your own destruction. Some battles choose you, whether you're ready or not. When that happens, the only choice is whether you'll fight to win or surrender to people who see your love as weakness and your trust as opportunity. I chose to fight, and I won. Not just in court, not just financially, but in the deeper sense of refusing to let evil people turn me into someone I didn't recognize. I remained Dorothy Sinclair, older, wiser, more careful, but still fundamentally decent and still capable of hope. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and share it with someone special who needs to hear what I lived through. This is a space of love and respect, and every day there's a different story of strong, courageous women who never gave up. That's who we are, survivors, fighters, women who discovered that we were stronger than anyone ever told us we could be. And that discovery, terrible as the circumstances were that led to it, has become the foundation for lives that no one can take away from us ever again.